Right, good morning everybody, and thank you Bronwyn for inviting me. This is going to be rather different from the previous paper. There is one graph, and there is one table, but mostly I think you'll find it fairly science-free, so you can either think that this is, well, let's say it's going to be something which is completely different, as somebody once said. I'm going to talk, as you can see, about a very short history of silage. When I say a very short history, that's what I mean. One could talk about silage, and if you're not very careful, I will, for a very long time. One of the questions that I think this raises, and that I want you to hold in your minds until I get to the end, is the question of what is tradition, where does it start from, and what impact does it have? Because I think the question of what is tradition is behind Bronwyn's invitation to me to, or persuading me or telling me that I was going to talk to you this morning. So let's go back to the beginning, if we can. The earliest record, and I don't think this means that it's the absolute beginning, but it simply means it's the earliest record. The earliest record that I can find that really relates to this comes from 1873, when we can find a record of the first silo in the USA. And in fact, most US dairy farmers were using silage in one form or another by about 1890, according to the things that I've been able to find out. But it's important to point out that this was maize silage, or generally speaking, it was maize silage, to the point where a guy called Fred Shannon, a historian called Fred Shannon, writing in 1945, could produce this statement: about all that was to be found out about the preparation and storage of silage was known before 1900, which I think is going to come as a shock to some people, but that's how people felt about it at the time. They felt comfortable with the technology that they had in the USA, which clearly was a lot more was different. It was about maize, and USA farming was a lot more mechanized. In 1874, to turn to the UK, a very prominent English agricultural scientist called John Wrightson went on a tour of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his report talked about the production of what he called sour hay, particularly in Hungary. Now, this attracted a lot of attention at the time because the years between 1875 and 1884 were very wet. I mean, at one point, Benjamin Disraeli, who had been the Prime Minister by that time, had been given a landed estate, emerged from his house and asked the labourers if they felt that the dove might have left the ark yet. So that gives, it was wet. And so there was great interest in this idea of something that would produce winter fodder without the necessity for too much drying. And Earl Cathcart in, I think, Yorkshire in 1875 was producing something called pickled hay. In 1882, the Vicomte de Chazelles came from France to give a demonstration in the Royal Show of silage, and an MP called Thorold Rogers wrote a letter to the Times saying, given the current wet conditions, is silage the answer? And in 1884, the Royal Agricultural Society commissioned its secretary, a man called Jenkins, to produce a report on silage. And his report demonstrates an enormous variety of silage making methods. So, at first sight, silage has been around for more than 100 years, since the end of the 19th century. If, however, you look at this graph, which is a semi-log graph, so that the left-hand scale is logarithmic. What it shows you is that the amount of silage being produced at the end of the 19th century was actually really rather small. It was very much a matter of a few people who tended to be either better off farmers or, more commonly, rather large landowners who could afford the experiments and who could afford the capital cost, because they were putting in big silos and spending a lot of money on it, and also spending a lot of money on persuading lots of labourers to shift this stuff around, because it tended to be wet and heavy, and it was all being done with manual labour. So it's perhaps not surprising that after the 1890s, farmers in general were not really very interested in silage. Scientists, on the other hand, were fascinated. And if you look at the Journal of the Royal Agriculture, the Journal of Agricultural Science, which began publication in 1905, you find that scientists are fascinated by, is it a microbiological process? Is it a chemical process? You know, what actually is going on in the production of silage? So people at Cambridge University, for example, a guy called Amos, did an awful lot of work in the 1920s and 1930s. And by the time you get to the Second World War, you can see from about 1940 there's a very definite little sort of, what should we call it, a micro peak kind of thing. There's a lot of official encouragement of silage in the Second World War, essentially because it's about increasing homegrown protein to save protein imports, which were clearly, you know, there's a wartime import problem. So when we look at what's happening in the war, there's a bit of a peak, and then a decrease post-war, and then a gradual kind of increase. You can see it rather more clearly if you look at the tonnage figures. In 1889, there's something like 11 million tons of hay being produced in Britain, which obviously is rather higher than later. If you think why that is, well, in 1889 there are an awful lot of urban horses to be fed, and a lot of that hay will go into the towns for the horse market there. But it was also an extremely, 1889 happened to be a good year for hay. Contrast that with 150,000 tons of silage being produced. You know, it's a tiny amount in comparison. And the same applies at the beginning of the war. About 250,000 tonnes of silage as compared to 8 million tonnes of hay. So it's still, a minority interest. And the growth, although the growth is significant by 1960, you're still finding that the bulk of the stuff, and particularly if you look in dry matter terms, of course, because the silage being produced at that sort of time is 25-30% dry matter. So significant, whereas hay obviously is about 85% dry matter. So significant difference. And you don't really get silage overtaking hay in dry matter terms until the end of the 1970s. I mean, in total tonnage, it's the beginning of the 1970s when silage finally becomes more important than hay. But in dry matter terms, it's not until later in the 1970s. And then in the 1980s, suddenly, hay is decreasing in significance quite enormously, and silage is really taking off. So we can say that by the end of the 1980s, silage is the dominant form of winter feed. So, okay, that's what happened. Now, how do we explain it? Well, what we need to look at, I think, is the way that cows are fed in the summer and the way that they're fed in the winter. And clearly, the two are related, because the grass that you're not feeding in the summer is the basis of your winter forage, or at least it is until large amounts of maize start getting grown, and that doesn't happen until about the 1990s anyway. So if you look at summer feed, clearly concentrates are one aspect of it, but the major aspect of it is going to be grass. And all these things are changing in the period between the beginning of the Second World War, let's say, and the end of the 1970s. Grass varieties change. I think the one that's really significant as far as silage is concerned is that you get a much greater emphasis on ryegrasses, and in particular, of course, you get the introduction of tetraploid ryegrasses, which are a lot leafier than previous varieties. You also, of course, get a lot simpler seeds mixtures. If you look at the kind of seeds mixtures that are being recommended in agricultural textbooks in 1940, then it's not uncommon to find 8 different grass species, and clearly that tends to get a lot more simplified as you go through to the 1970s. The other thing that changes is fertilizer use, and obviously by the 1970s, nitrogen use in particular has increased dramatically. I mean, we're talking about going from, an average usage of probably less than 50 kilograms per hectare to some people using as much as 300 or 400 kilograms per hectare. That's not the average, but it shows you where it could get to. Now, all those factors, of course, made for heavier hay crops, and therefore hay crops that were more difficult to dry. And that's therefore one of the factors that farmers have to take into account when they're thinking about winter forage. Okay, they've got concentrates, but are they going to use hay or silage? Remembering that that hay is getting, okay, you can produce a decent hay crop, as somebody said, given 3 or 4 days of decent June weather. All you've got to do, particularly in the north and west, is to find 3 or 4 days of decent June weather. So the more grass you produce, the more difficult it becomes to make hay. So we did some work at Exeter on data from the Farm Management Survey, which, for those of you who don't know, is a sample survey that was designed to give some data on farm incomes. But it resulted in the production of a great deal of very detailed information, which on a sample of mostly dairy farms in the southwest, which, because somebody forgot about them, remained in a repository in the university until we could come 40 years later and discover that some farmers had got significant runs of data, in some cases up to 40 years. So we could really examine what was going on these farms in great detail. And what we found was that there was a general pattern of changes in winter feed on dairy farms. Up to the 1950s, it was a matter of hay and roots, basically. And when I say roots, I mean particularly mangels, but also things like flat-pole cabbage. And then from the 1950s to the 1960s, there was a changeover to kale, very often associated with the introduction of electric fencing, because you could, self-feed with the aid of an electric fence. But some farmers were very reluctant to give up things like mangels. I mean, I remember as a student saying to some farmer, these things are 85% water. And he looked at me and he said, "Ah, boy, but 'tis good water." And so there's a kind of, a traditional hanging on to what farmers were used to doing. But we can see that by the 1970s, there is a general move over to grass silage, from the 1970s, a move to grass silage, which by the 1990s is pretty ubiquitous. And then from the 1990s onwards, it's a mixture of maize, grass and maize silage. The maize silage generally, or very often, being done by contractors. So we've got two things to explain. First of all, why the delay? And then why the change? The delay in the adoption of silage from the 1890s is, I think, reasonably easy to explain. When farms were moving stuff about by manual labour, stuff in general. When wheat was shifted about in 200-weight sacks, that kind of thing. Silage was bad news because you were moving a lot of water about. They also didn't like the smell. There's a well-known writer called Primrose McConnell who said, "I experimented with silage and I hated it. The smell was as bad as 10 motor cars." Don't know what was wrong with his motor car, but the time that it was happening was also very often clashed with the time of root hoeing, which was, an important part, as we've seen, of the feed mix. Probably very significantly are these high capital requirements, which meant that the early adopters were the big farmers and the landowners. And frankly, they weren't very good at making very good quality silage. There was still a lot to be found out about how you made decent silage. And of course, concentrates were relatively cheap. Certainly up to about the 1970s, concentrates were pretty cheap. So a mixture of hay and concentrates, would generally do the trick. So that's why there was a delay. Now, given that, why should people change? As I'm sure those of you who are directly involved in farming will remember, the amount of labour on the land decreased, and with it the root area decreased as well, quite significantly after the Second World War. And I'm not going to go into the figures because they're widely available. The other thing was, I think that people became much more aware of the importance of digestibility. And the idea, that you would wait until the grass was reasonably dry, heading up. Very often I think it must have looked like bits of wire by the time it got actually made into hay, and it was. The impact of more nitrogen and the more leafy species meant that more wilting was required, so drying was more difficult. Mechanization in two senses. First of all, in terms of materials handling, initially with buck rakes and then with more complicated machinery, and secondly, of course, the introduction of the forage harvester, which was a major change. The first forage harvesters were disastrous. I remember something called the silerator, which worked very slowly and could be heard at least half a mile away. And it was a sort of high-pitched whine, which after a day really got into your ears. High fuel prices meant that the alternative, which was grass drying, which operated on a significant scale in the 1960s, and barn hay drying, were high fuel prices just ruled them out. But most important, of course, was improved technology, improved silage making technology, new additives, tower silos, the idea of self-feed silos, cheap polythene sheet, the development of the Dorset wedge technique, and really a kind of system change as farmers moved over to milking parlours and loose housing or cubicles. Then it made sense to, or it was easier to get cows to self-feed, and then you had the introduction of forage wagons and so on. Later on, big bales. So a whole lot of new bits of technology, which, if you're in farming, you'll be pretty familiar with. So to come to a conclusion, I want to take you back to where I started. When does a tradition begin? I wonder if a tradition starts with what you remember as a child. My childhood memories involve sliding down a stack of loose hay on my uncle's farm. It made him absolutely furious because, of course, he had to, throw it up again onto the stack. I thought it was great fun. So my idea of traditional winter feed production centres around hay, because I remember sacks of loose hay. I spent day after day after day as a teenager and as a young man, either on a bale sledge or stacking bales, or so it's tradition. Now, if you're 20 or 30 years younger than me, that's not your tradition. So your tradition is a rather different one, because what you remember as a young farmer or as somebody just coming in is much more likely to be making silage. There's the other thing that I think we should point out is this difference between Britain and America. The tradition, if you like, in America might be rather different because of their history of maize silage production. And the third thing that I think I've mentioned already, but is worth emphasizing, is that silage wasn't a simple swap over from one kind of forage production to another kind of forage production. It required an entire system change, in which farmers would very often have to change the place in which they were milking cows, the place in which the cows were housed, the way in which they carried on their grazing, the time at which they harvested their grass, and all the machinery associated with that. You might be tooled up with with cock pheasant tedders and small balers and all the rest of it. Forget about it. You need a completely different set of machinery. But all of those technical changes happened after my childhood, so for me, they weren't traditional. And on that point, I'll stop. Thank you.